Hello and welcome to Press Pass on GNet TV's News Project. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And it's also my pleasure to have with us a distinguished panel of fellow journalists here who will be discussing some of the issues and major news stories of the past few weeks that have taken place around Bennington County. With us today is Cherise Madigan, who is a reporter for both the Bennington Banner and the Manchester Journal, and no stranger, of course, at GNet TV with her own show, Vermont Voices. And we also have with us today Derek Carson from the Bennington Banner, who's a reporter, covers education, among a lot of other things down there. And Derek, great to have you with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So we were both at a meeting of the Arlington School Board just to kind of get things started here on this past Wednesday on July 26th, I guess it was. Where the Arlington School Board, it finds itself kind of trying to figure out where it's going to go under Act 46. And they've been kind of batting this subject around for a while, and they don't really have a good, obvious dance partner, as the term goes. And then earlier this month, another unexpected development, at least it seemed unexpected to me, arose when a letter was received by the Arlington School Board from the Byrne-Burton Board of Trustees, from Seth Bongartz, the chair, attempting to make it clear anyway that should Arlington decide that it may not want to operate a high school any longer, Byrne-Burton would be a place where Arlington parents could send their kids. And then, of course, that got some conversation started back on July 11th, I think was when that letter was received. So, then we had the follow-up then this past Wednesday. So I guess, what was your takeaway on the whole thing, Derek, and kind of where do you see Arlington going?
Well, I think you said it perfectly, and as William Basic said it, their superintendent at this last meeting, they've really for over a year been in a holding pattern, waiting to see what the BRSU is doing, waiting to see where they can kind of fit into this new structure that's developing in the region, because as you said, they don't have a dance partner. The idea of potentially closing their high school and sending students to Byrne-Burton isn't one that I've heard a lot of community members supporting. Honestly, back when these discussions were starting, the reason they went into a holding pattern is they knew they wouldn't be a fit with, say, Manchester and what's in the Taconic and Green school district now, because they are proud of their high school and they wanted to keep operating that high school. And I really, since that letter was received, haven't seen a lot of indication that there's a lot of interest in going in that direction. And the board had made it very clear they didn't want to touch that at all.
No.
And so the only way something like that could happen is if a group of voters who wanted to see Arlington become a school choice district for grades 9 through 12, they would have to start a petition, get it on the ballot, and get it approved. As of right now, I haven't seen a big groundswell of that, but there is still time. They're still waiting for, right now, the districts Stratton, Winhall, and Sandgate, the full choice districts in the BRSU, to sort of hammer out their articles of agreement to see maybe if Arlington can do a 3x1 with them, or if several different options, none of them great options. But as of now, all indications still point to Arlington continuing to operate pre-K through 12.
So under the 3x1 scenario, it would have Stratton, Winhall, and Sandgate being the three non-operating districts, full choice districts, kind of joining in an association with Arlington, which would be a pre-K through 12 district.
Right.
And all four of those districts would then come into the BRSU and be basically another district within the BRSU.
Exactly. So that's sort of why you've had to see all this wait and see, to let Taconic and Green figure out what they were doing, to let all the districts of the BRSU figure out what they were doing, because Arlington was always going to be sort of that outsider, and it was never clear. Act 49 gave them a better path forward, perhaps, with this 3x1, which was a structure introduced under that legislation. So perhaps that makes their path forward a little clearer, but they were always going to be kind of an outsider, but certainly part of some BRSU structure. We're starting to see that take place now.
And William Basic, the new superintendent of the Battenkill Valley Supervisor Union, made it clear that any change, whether it's the 3x1 route or the school choice route, would only happen after a community had weighed in and made it clear which way they wanted to go. And I think there was some talk of a community forum of some sort.
In September was, I believe, because he thought August was when those three districts would hammer out their own articles of agreement. So then a month later in September is when Arlington really needs to start thinking about specifically what its community wants its path forward to be.
Well, it'd be interesting to see because, I mean, the school choice idea certainly opens up some possibilities for them. I mean, one of the things I keep hearing about in Arlington is that real estate values are kind of, stagnant might be one way of putting it. They're not rising. Let's put it that way. And school choice might open up a possibility for them to see some of those real estate values go upwards.
And we have a little bit of experience with this down in the South Shire, because of course several years ago North Bennington decided to close their public elementary school, open it as an independent academy not run by the town, have choice for elementary and up through 6th grade. And they did see benefits to their community. Property values did go up. People were moving in and saying that they'd moved in because of the option of choice. Most of their students do still go to what's now the Village School of North Bennington, but you see some go to Shaftesbury, some go to other smaller independent schools within the region. So far they have very much enjoyed the choice that offered. But that's not to say it wasn't a difficult process. It took several years, I believe 3 different votes. The state was not necessarily cooperative with them. They still have gripes about how that situation was handled. And now with Act 46, they find themselves, much like Arlington, without a partner. So there are certainly pros and cons to going in that direction.
Well, it'll be a fascinating story to follow, and one we'll be looking at closely, I'm sure, particularly starting in September with this community forum. So while we're on Act 46 and school consolidations, I gather there's some news to report about the SVSU, the Southwestern Vermont Supervisory Union down in Bennington, that kind of follows along with the Arlington situation.
Absolutely. Much like Arlington, they found themselves in a holding pattern for several years where they formed a study committee, closed the study committee, formed an informal study committee, then shut down that study committee. Now they've got a new study committee. They hired Dan French, who's probably familiar to North Shire folks. He was the superintendent of the BRSU and acted as their Act 46 consultant, still is doing that, I believe. He's also will be working with Arlington. So he's gone down to Bennington and they've really identified, North Bennington has sort of walked away from the table at this point. They know that they didn't see any value getting involved in this study committee. They feel that the state is just going to attach them onto the side of whatever the SVSU comes up with. So they said, we don't want you involving us in the discussion, just do what's best for your communities and we'll figure out where we're going to fit in at the end. So you have Shaftesbury, Pownell, Woodford, and Bennington now working together. They've essentially agreed on what they want a merger to look like. It would have a single board that would follow the Mount Anthony Union model. So I believe they call it the alternative representation model, where all people from all of the communities can vote on representatives from each. So say Pownell has a representative on this board, but there are people from Bennington who are voting for which person from Pownell. So it's kind of an interesting combination of a proportional and at-large model, but they felt that it has really worked for the Mount Anthony Union District for their middle and high schoolers for all these years, and they felt that that would be what would be best for the community going forward. That's not to say they're thrilled about the concept of a merger, but all indication from the state is that the SVSU, it's not like the North Shire necessarily, all the schools are operating pre-K through 12, or pre-K through 6 or 5, and then sending their students to the Mount Anthony District. In this situation, it would probably be that the Mount Anthony Union District is dissolved, pre-K through 12. That's not necessarily true. There is still some wiggle room there where they could form an elementary school district that would be unified and then Mount Anthony would still exist. That sort of depends on North Bennington and what the state's plan is for them. But for now, they're moving very quickly because their goal is to have a plan, articles of agreement agreed upon and submitted to the state by August so that they can have a community vote in November that will basically decide whether this goes up or down.
Okay, well, to be continued.
Right.
We're just talking about Arlington, Charisse, and you had a story that we discussed the last time you were here last month about Dorothy Canfield Fisher that at that point was kind of an eye-opener for many of us. Dorothy Canfield Fisher, a very revered author and former resident of Arlington from the 1930s, very famous writer. Turns out that she had an interest in the eugenics movement that was, I guess, sort of, prevailing out there in America in the 1920s and 1930s. So what's been the follow-up to that? She was or was not so much involved in this after all? What's the story?
Yeah, so a few things have happened since we last talked. On July 11th, there was a Board of Libraries meeting in Montpelier, or just outside in Berlin, where it was kind of supposed to be about a 45-minute discussion. Someone had signed up to speak in favor of Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Judy Dow had returned to defend her position that, Fisher's name should be removed from the State Book Award. And that 45-minute discussion turned into a 3-hour heated debate with yelling, screaming, fists banging on tables. I know a lot of the board was just kind of trying to keep the peace at that time, and they ultimately delayed a decision on the book award. Since then, locally, there's been a lot of response to it. I know the community house in Arlington, which I think was gifted to the community by Dorothy Canfield Fisher in 1948, they came out in support of the author and said that, these ties aren't really concrete, and either way, our founding fathers have these really dark histories with slavery as well. It doesn't outweigh all of the good that they did, ultimately, and that this could be a teachable moment, and that we can learn more about eugenics in that dark history, but still keep Fisher's name on the award, because she did do a lot of great things. And in the process of kind of writing up a piece about that response, I also heard from the granddaughter of Dorothy Canfield Fisher fairly unexpectedly. She had read what was happening in Vermont and decided to contact us and kind of put forth her piece of the story, which made things a little more complicated. She had said that, she knew her grandmother well. She didn't see her that often when she came up here, but that she had heard a lot about her character from her mother and her father. And her father was actually one of the leading geneticists at that time. And she had heard from her mother since she was a young girl that in the 1930s, the early 30s, when her parents first met and got married, when Dorothy Canfield Fisher met her soon-to-be son-in-law, who was a leading geneticist, he said, "This isn't real science. Eugenics has no basis in reality, and sterilization should not be a policy." And according to her granddaughter, at least, Dorothy Canfield Fisher heard the science, realized that she had been misled by people who misrepresented their knowledge, probably Henry Perkins, and changed her opinion. So I don't know where that necessarily leaves us now. We have probably the most concrete evidence we'll ever get saying that she knew what eugenics was, she knew she was supporting it, and she actually went a step further and said that her grandmother supported sterilization. Even she was in the likes of Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. She supported eugenics and sterilization as well. So it was a progressive movement, and Dorothy Canfield Fisher did support it, so that is kind of a moot point at this point. I know a lot of the debate has been whether she was really tied to it or if she understood that she was. But she did change her mind too, so we'll see where that leaves us. We're still waiting for kind of an ultimate decision by the Martha Canfield Library in Arlington. Their board meets, I think August 7th, they'll be meeting and definitely discussing the topic. And then Fisher Elementary School, which is named after Dorothy Canfield Fisher, has not made any comment thus far. So we'll see where that goes.
Fascinating. It's always interesting to think about, how values change over time, or perceptions of things, where at one point that was considered, well, okay or whatever. 100 years later or so, it's like, oh my God, why would people have thought that in the first place?
Yeah.
It's interesting to look at it. Well, meanwhile, a few other things have been going on up in the North Shore as well that you've reported on. One of them was the opening of the Hampton Inn, long delayed, but finally now open a few weeks or so ago. And I know for a long time that was a big discussion point around here about how that was going to affect the local lodging industry, number one, and just sort of, how travel and tourism in the area in general. I mean, have you heard anything further about it so far since the opening?
Not much so far, and I should point out that their opening that came recently was a soft opening.
Right.
So they're planning a fuller opening in the fall, and I know that was heavily delayed. When I had talked to them last, they had said Memorial Day weekend was the planned soft opening, and even that was a delayed date, and delays continued, I think, because of weather and things like that. But at this point, I think that they're not running necessarily to full capacity, so I think we'll really see during leaf peeper season, when we've got a lot of tourists in the area for ITV Fest and everything else that happens in Vermont in the fall when it looks so gorgeous. We'll see how packed they are and what difference that makes in the lodging industry.
It's certainly been a long-running controversial subject. I remember 3 or 4 years ago going to Planning Commission meetings and hearing heated debate about whether or not this was a good idea or not, and how this would affect existing lodging businesses, and some of them were a little bit concerned that this was maybe one lodging establishment too many for what the traffic would bear, but I guess as you say, we'll find out. I was just thinking, Derek, let's go back down south again, south on Route 7 to cover a few other things here. We had a couple of interesting things happen in Bennington this week around the long-running PFOA scandal event. A year and a half ago, roughly, contaminated water was discovered in some private wells in North Bennington. About 200 or so, I think, were affected. Not the municipal water system, I think is important to note, but contamination from the former St. Cobain factory that made a derivative that was used in Teflon coatings, I believe. So this week, St. Cobain and the state reached some kind of a settlement.
Well, I think it's best to call it a preliminary settlement because both in the words of the attorneys for the citizens that have been affected by this in North Bennington and in Attorney General T.J. Donovan, both have called this a first step. This is going to be $20 million that will extend the municipal water system from Bennington up to certain residences in North Bennington that have been affected by this. There are several reasons why you should really only call this a first step. That's not to say it isn't a big step. This is very good for a lot of these people who have been using point-of-contact filtration systems ever since the contamination was discovered. This will certainly be a big step for them, but there is still more testing to do. This will not reach all of the affected households. That's estimated it's going to cost about another $10 million even on top of this. More testing is required, and some of the residents are, in addition, seeking damages for effects to their health, for not being able to use their private wells anymore and being forced to incur the costs of being on the town water system, things like that. So this certainly isn't over. But this is a big first step, and $20 million is going to go a long way to help some of those residents.
So these folks whose wells were affected, I mean, what have they been doing for the past year and a half in terms of water? Are they just drinking bottled water? Or?
No, for the first several months they were drinking bottled water. That was provided by the state, and the Village of North Bennington worked together to get that bottled water. They had distribution points set up. Since then, St. Cobain has been very cooperative in helping to fund point-of-contact filtration systems, basically right at the wells that filter the water, and that's been doing a good job, but they do need to be replaced periodically, so that really isn't considered a long-term solution. By extending those water lines, while they won't be able to use their private wells anymore, they will now at least be connected to a source of clean water. Bennington's municipal water line, there's been no trace of PFOA. It's been heavily tested. They weren't so lucky in Pownell. That situation is getting cleared up. Hoosick Falls, of course, still has a long way to go. So PFOA continues to be a problem in the region, but as you say, this settlement certainly represents working towards a solution, and a permanent solution.
Well, certainly another long-running drama that interesting to see. We're finally beginning to move somewhere to a closure around that. Sharice, I wanted to ask you about another story that you had a couple of weeks ago in the Journal about the controversy surrounding these all are welcome signs. One would have thought that that would have been the most uncontroversial thing imaginable, but I guess that's sort of a bit of a hornet's nest, is that the right word? Or at least some kind of a backlash or controversy?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So the controversy really didn't begin until after the article had come out, and I wouldn't call it a controversy nonetheless. It's really a controversy to my ears only, as I understand it. But a group in Manchester, Move On Manchester, their progressive activist group, decided that they would go around to local businesses. I think they went on foot and walked around to local businesses and provided these signs designed by a local artist, a student from Pownell, I think actually, who designed these great signs that say all are welcome, and it's meant to be inclusive of anybody, regardless of your ability or your race, religion, sexuality, anything like that. And a lot of places in town have put these up, so hence I wrote an article on that. And the response I've heard from a lot of people is that maybe it's problematic in a community that's really largely white to be saying that all are welcome when really there's not a lot of diversity that exists here. And then some of the other backlash I heard was that, some of the businesses that put these up don't have ramps for people that are differently abled or things like that. And that's a valid question as well. And maybe it's another one of those learning moments where we can take a look at our inclusivity and see where we have to go. But I think it is interesting because we are a largely white state, but we've got a big tourist economy as well. And I don't think that everyone coming here is necessarily fitting in those same kind of statistical breakdowns that our state does. So it'll be interesting to see where that conversation goes.
Yeah, well, it would have seemed like, why would anyone have had a problem with that about, but I guess you never know. And Kind of a similar situation. We had a chance to hear a little bit about last Monday night over at the Manchester
Yeah.
Community Library when a group of folks organized a meeting titled "Can We Talk?" I guess the idea would be to bridge the political divide that has at least been perceived since the election, probably well before the election, about folks who have different points of view politically speaking. And this was an attempt to kind of get, about 100 people or so in the room, at least talking about or kind of getting a better idea about where people were coming from. We didn't get to the point of talking about actual current events or specific situations that have existed for the past 6 or 7 months, but it was an attempt to recognize that, well, everybody has their point of view, and that should be valid, and we should respect that. I guess, what did you make from the meeting? Did it strike you that we moved in that direction, or I gather there's supposed to be a follow-up of some sort as well?
Yeah, and I hope that that really continues and that dialogue continues. And honestly, I'm heartened every time I see something like that. I think at the library, there was kind of a wider group of people there. It wasn't all liberal people, it wasn't all conservative people there just to espouse their own opinions to anyone who might be willing to listen. But it was a group led by two people who were very different politically. You've got Rabbi Michael Cohen, who's very left of center, but has experience trying to broker peace in the Middle East, in a sense, through the Arava Institute. And you've got Judy Livingston, who was in the Vermont legislature for, I think, 14 years. I may be mistaken on that. For quite a while.
Yeah.
She had a long history, and she was a Republican member of the legislature, but she also worked on bridging that political divide. So you've got these two leaders who are guiding about 100 or so people from the community to not talk about politics, but talk about their own lives and what really shaped their political opinion, and how did they come to be so liberal, or how did they come to be so conservative, and what was really emotionally guiding that in your personal history. And I think that understanding someone else's background and where they come from can be a really big first step in not brawling, but actually having a dialogue and discussing, because a conservative will have great points, a liberal will have great points, and maybe there's a middle ground to be reached.
Well, the interesting point I think will come when, should there be a follow-up meeting to that,
We actually talk
get down into talking about specifics about why someone who voted for Hillary Clinton and someone who voted for Donald Trump can't be in the same room at the same time.
And it's so divisive and emotional.
Would be able to kind of say, okay, well, I understand why, whatever. That's I think going to be the interesting part. And,
Absolutely.
kind of along that line, Derek, we were both at another meeting at the library a couple of weeks before that. The Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning hosted a debate that had to do with the news media, something that's a subject near and dear to our hearts here.
Absolutely.
It was kind of an interesting discussion.
It was a fascinating discussion, and just to catch people up who haven't seen it, I believe it was filmed by GNet, so you can find it there. But the topic of the debate was essentially, if media, if the job of the media is to educate the populace, is media doing its job? Which had a lot of opinions on both sides. You got to see some of that political divisiveness. One of the parts that was most interesting to me was after the formal debate, they went around and gave people a short amount of time, 2 or 3 minutes, to sort of give their own opinion on the issue. And a lot of the opinions were, well, the conservative media is failing, or the liberal media is failing. So you got to see some of that same divide that you're talking about. But one of the points that was made, that was brought up during that debate, was media bubbles. And perhaps that's part of the answer to why you see people with such divided belief systems, almost to the point where you could say they're almost living in two different realities. Because in a sense, if you look at the media that you consume and the media that someone perhaps on the other side of the political divide consumes, they almost are like two different realities. You can look at the exact same event that I was actually guest teaching at a middle school class recently, where we were discussing just this topic, bias in the news media. And I took a New York Times article, a Breitbart article, and a Huffington Post article, all on the exact same topic, and just talked to the students about how, even when everyone agrees on the basic facts, which they don't always, then you can see how those facts can be presented in different ways that can give completely different opinions. So in the end, the audience felt that the media as a whole, I believe, the consensus is providing the information, but people aren't necessarily educated, and they don't necessarily know how to access that information or how to best access that information. So certainly there are failings in the system, but the information does seem to be out there.
And one of the points one of the speakers made, I think, near the start of that was that, back in the so-called good old days, you had 3 major networks and a handful of major national newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and a couple of others. Mm-hmm. And that was the news. Life magazine and a few other, Time and Newsweek. And now, of course, we have the Tower of Babel going on with all the social media platforms and opportunities that people have to express themselves. So it's really a much different ballgame than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Right, not only are there hundreds of different sources for news, but then also the filters for which you're getting that news. Did you see it on Twitter? Did you see it on Facebook? Did your friend at the barbershop tell you about it? There's so many different ways that we experience the news compared to when everyone sat down and watched Walter Cronkite, which is, I believe, one of the things they brought up in that debate. So that was definitely worth a watch if you hadn't had the chance to see that yet. Very entertaining and very educational.
Yeah, and it was fascinating to listen to, and great stuff to take part in. Well, we have time for just one more program note, I guess you might say. And Cherise, you need to tell us a little bit about this upcoming show you have on your show, Vermont Voices. You have a distinguished guest coming here to the studio.
Yeah, so at Vermont Voices on August 11th at 1 o'clock, we're going to be joined by Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. And it'll be a great opportunity. Anyone who comes to the studio audience will be able to ask him their questions and talk with him. But also, he's so accessible personally. I know I've been to events with him where he usually takes the time to speak with people and try to kind of converse with his constituents. So it'll be a really exciting time, and I hope a lot of people come on by.
So you're going to have him, the two of you will talk for a little while, and then the studio audience will be able to ask some questions of the Lieutenant Governor?
Yeah, so the plan for right now, depending on the size of the studio audience we get, if we have a ton of people, I'll curb my own questions, but hopefully him and I will have a short conversation, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then on the second half of the show, Vermont Voices is usually 30 minutes long. For the second half, we'll have audience questions and participation, so it'll be a really great opportunity.
Well, that sounds like fun. I think I'll have to be here for that. I may be here anyway, so it should be easy.
You just might.
Well, great. Well, I guess that'll have to do it for now, but I want to thank you both for taking the time to be here and share some of the background on some of these big stories that have been going down in the last couple of weeks, and sounds like we'll have a lot more to come, too. And I want to thank Derek Carson from the Bennington Banner, Cherise Madigan from the Banner and the Journal, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV. It's been a pleasure to be with you today, and we'll see you the next time.